Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Keeping Sports Safe, Safe Sports Speaker Series brought to you by the Canadian Sports Centre Manitoba and Fit Women and Girls. We would like to acknowledge, first off, that we are gathered on ancestral lands, Treaty 1 territory, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Acknowledging this truth is important, yet only a small part in cultivating strong relationships with Indigenous communities, something that we continue to work towards. For those of us joining for the first time, my name is Jessie. I'm a CSCM team member, and I will be moderating these sessions. I would ask that you all please remain on mute until it is time for questions, which we will be doing at the end. And then you can use the raise your hand function that's located at the bottom of your screen. Or if you would prefer to type a question in the chat box, we'll be monitoring that as well, and that's perfectly all right too. These sessions are being recorded for your reference once they are complete, and you will be getting an email from us later on with a link to that. As you will have noticed, this series is being hosted like a meeting as opposed to a webinar. So our aim is to foster open and honest conversation as we work to educate and train over the next couple weeks. So tonight we're super fortunate to be joined by LJ Bartle and Michelle Kropp, two members from Sport Law and Strategy Group. We will be talking for potentially up to 90 minutes tonight. So we do hope that everyone is able to stick around. We're going to have a super interactive session, which is great. I'm going to pass it over to these two ladies, and I'm going to be including a couple worksheets in the chat for you. All right.
All right, thanks, Jessie, and welcome everyone. My name is LJ Bartle. I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement as well before we get started. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendake, and I'm very grateful that they are the stewards and caretakers of the lands and waters here. Michelle?
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Kropp. Thank you for having me tonight. I am seeing you now from Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional home of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. Thank you.
Thanks. So just, and we will share a copy of the PowerPoint as well. So Jessie will be able to send that out for you, so you don't worry about taking notes. There's a fillable PDF in the chat right now. One's called a Safe Sport Implementation Strategy Workshop, and the other one is the Safe Sport Complaints Worksheet. So I encourage you to download those. So for my part, we're going to be talking about strategy, and Michelle will really talk about complaints. So if you want to download those, and you can sort of fill them out as we go. We're not going to spend a ton of time on them. During our presentation, what we want to do is afterwards, we'll give you a chance to either come into a room with us or talk to us as part of the larger group. But if we want to work through those worksheets at that time, we're happy to continue to work through it. So the agenda that we want to take you through today is really just an overview of safe sport, and then how to be a proactive board, making sure you have all the right stuff and how to actually put it into practice, and then talk a bit about what happens if you end up being a reactive board, so also known as how to manage complaints. So and then we'll do a Q&A and potentially dive deeper into the worksheets. Also, if everybody wants to sort of type into the chat why it was important for them to attend this webinar today, that'll help us make sure that we are addressing some of your concerns, or if you have key questions that you really want to make sure get answered, just feel free to type them into the chat, and hopefully we'll be covering those things. And if not now, we'll cover it after. So a little bit about Sport Law and Strategy Group. It really is a one-stop shop for Canadian sport. We work with all levels of Canadian sport system, from the national sport organizations, provincial, territorial sport organizations, and local. Also work in the university sector and in government. And in all of these areas, from legal solutions to strategic planning, strategic implementation, and leadership development. This is our team, really 11 people who have diverse backgrounds in either law or strategy or coaching, etc. This is a little bit about me. My areas of expertise are safe sport implementation and strategic planning, as well as facilitation. My background is that I was a CBC News journalist for about 15 years. My next career moved on to High Five National Director. And if any of you have heard of High Five, it's a national quality standard for children's sport and recreation. I'm also a certified investigator, and I prefer to work on the proactive side of things. Michelle?
Hello again. This is me. So basically, I came to Sport Law and Strategy Group about a year ago. My background is pretty much all litigation. I've done all kinds of litigation, including once upon a time criminal defense. So I've seen the worst of it. Typically, I guess over my career, I've done a lot of appeals work. So I see things when it gets to the Ontario Court of Appeal mostly. So it's already been through like 3, sometimes 4 court levels. And by the time it gets to me, I think I look back and I say, what could have been done differently to avoid this day, this outcome? So I often deal with stuff at the end, but then taking from that, we like to work backwards and say, how could we avoid this from happening again? What could we do better? So this is me. I'm all about the court, the advocacy, the policy work, and yes, as I said, I think I might have said I'm a lawyer. I have a science background, which seems odd, but they do go together. I am also an athlete of sorts, a karate instructor, and I have children and a dog, and so I try to maintain some kind of work-life balance. And that's me.
Thanks,
Back
Michelle.
to you, LJ.
Thanks. Actually, Jesse, I think we're gonna run our first poll right now. So as you can see on the screen too, we have a reactive arrow and a proactive arrow. So generally people come to safe sport one way or another. So we'll talk about both those directions. So here's the poll, I think. Okay, seeing about most of you have voted. Probably good, eh, Jesse?
Yeah, I'd say so. So, and this here showing the results. Everyone can see that. So for the first question of how familiar you are in the concept of safe sport, 44% said very confident. Great. 39% of confident, and then 17 at somewhat. And then for the second question of how confident you are that your organization has everything in place to provide a safe and welcoming environment, mostly was confident with 56%, and then somewhat confident at 39%.
All right. Thanks. Well, that gives us a really good idea of the people on the call today. So obviously you have a lot of information about safe sport, which is great. So we won't spend a lot of time on that. I really did want to give you our definition of safe sport, which is physical and emotional safety, which includes concussion and injury prevention, and environments free from bullying, abuse, harassment, discrimination, and other forms of maltreatment. And you cannot have safe sport without equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. So we wanted to just put that out there as that's what we're working off of as a definition. You know, I'm sure you've heard of a lot of high profile cases in the US and Canada around sexual abuse, but really now I would say with the Gretchen Kerr, and for any of you who may have been on Gretchen's uh, webinar on Monday, I'm sure she talked all about this maltreatment study that she did with U of T. But what it showed was, well, she studied all forms of maltreatment, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, neglect, various types of harassment, bullying, and hazing. And what it showed is that athletes experience psychological abuse and neglect to a far greater extent than other forms. So that has been the main concern. And the other concern is that this neglectful or psychological harmful behavior, such as demeaning, threatening, or humiliating comments, denying basic needs such as food, water, and safe training conditions, have really been accepted as normal practices in sport. So that's been, now the trend is more towards this maltreatment and the psychological abuse. So we really are in a new normal. It's a time of change, and things that may have been accepted in the past may no longer be accepted. I'm reminded of a quote from Alison Forsyth, who is a former Olympian in alpine racing. And when, I don't know if any of you attended the Safe Sports Summits that were happening a couple of years ago around this time, but when Alison came and spoke at the National Sports Summit in Ottawa, she had a quote and she said, "What are those things that are normalized in your sport that would never be accepted elsewhere?" And that really started a shift around, right, if it's not accepted at my office or at my school or other places in society, why are we accepting it in sport? And really, there's been this huge shift towards no longer accepting things that may have been happening in the past. So sport is adjusting. So what's happened in the past few years is that Sport Canada has created all kinds of new funding requirements for national sport organizations to address maltreatment. So they all have to adopt the new UCCMS. They need minimum safe sport training standards for everyone that comes into contact with athletes. And then there's going to be a new entity that's going to be in charge of implementing the UCCMS. And how that's appropriate for you if you are a provincial sport organization. The federal, provincial, and territorial governments committed to alignment during a meeting in Red Deer a couple of years ago and said, whatever happens at the national level, we want to align. Of course, lots of different things are happening. That's not necessarily happening at all levels, but we think it's a really good idea for alignment. And so a lot of national sport organizations, the provincial territorial sport organizations, and clubs are taking proactive and reactive approaches to safe sport and trying to create some alignment. So some of those proactive approaches. So Coaches Association of Canada has really led the way with the responsible coaching movement and the rule of two screening ethics as sort of the foundational pieces of the safe sport movement. Lots of national sport organizations are hiring full-time employees to oversee all things safe sport. Sometimes the PSOs can benefit from that. A great approach was that Gymnastics Canada came up with spotting guidelines, which defined appropriate physical contact. And a number of other sports have followed in that vein. For example, wrestling came up with exactly what is appropriate in terms of even hitting, as they would be doing on the mat. The SDRCC, the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada, has launched an investigation unit and a hotline. Respect in Sport launched a new activity leader training and Respect in the Workplace. True Sport created these value-based player and coach selection processes, which are really, really a holistic way to pick your players and pick your coaches. There are free resources that are available on True Sport's website. And it really does look at much more than just their physical and skill base for selecting your players. Canadian Women in Sport are doing gender equity audits. They have the same game tool. And then there's all kinds of other organizations with diversity training and inclusion initiatives that many organizations are using. Independent third party to manage complaints. That's kind of a given now for many organizations, so that athletes and others have feel that there is independence in the process. And then others are doing club management manuals to ensure that there's consistency and alignment with the safe sport policies. And again, so this new entity is going to be coming into play that will oversee the implementation of the UCCMS. One of the most proactive approaches we've been really promoting is this 4-step safe sport implementation strategy that we designed. So it really takes a more holistic approach because it starts with analysis. So you're gathering evidence on where you are. It goes to development to fill in the gaps with what you don't have, or identifying the things that other people have that you can use, and then implementation of all those things, and then measuring to see if it's all working. So it's a cycle of continuous improvement that is done in many other strategic sort of plans and approaches, but it really does work here to ensure that athletes and other stakeholders are included in ensuring those safe and welcoming environments. So a little bit about the analysis. And if you have downloaded the Safe Sport Strategy worksheet, this would be like one of the first questions that is on that. And it's, what practices do you have in place to ensure the physical and emotional safety of your athletes and others? So, this is where you might say, okay, well, we have some policies. We do mandate some training, usually maybe some coaches. You might need NCCP training. You might provide your athletes with a handbook or a manual. So what are the practices you have in place? So that's important to think about that, because the analysis part of this process is really looking at, you're reviewing what's supposed to be happening and then looking at what's actually happening. This establishes your baseline of evidence so that you can make evidence-based decisions. So the next question on the sheet says, what evidence does your organization have to show that what it's doing to ensure the physical and emotional safety of athletes is actually working? So, through the process that we've done with a number of organizations at multiple levels in Canada, we usually do surveys and interviews asking key questions about policy comprehension, about the training that they're doing, about the engagement that's actually happening within an organization with its different stakeholders. Because, excuse me, if an organization never engages with its stakeholders, how do you know that what you're doing is working? So on the athlete survey, lots of times the questions are really focused on, do they feel safe? And do they even know about some of these practices that are in place for their safety? So, for example, athletes are often asked if they know that there's a coach's code of conduct. And most of them never know that there is a coach's code of conduct, and they certainly don't know what's in that coach's code of conduct. So if you have all your coaches sign a code of conduct, but you never actually share that information with your athletes, then who is it telling them? So you're relying potentially on your coach maybe to explain that they do sign a code of conduct and what's in it to their athletes. But if that coach doesn't, then how would the athletes know that they're not supposed to be texting the coach at 10 o'clock at night to tell them about their day, and not talking about anything sport related? So these are some of the things that provide the evidence that what's working. Another organization we're working with it's interesting because they're probably the best organization in terms of concussion policies and training. They have everybody do it. And still within that organization, the understanding and comprehension that there is a concussion protocol in place and that and what exactly they're supposed to be doing was very low among the athletes. And even around the coaches, they would say stuff like, well, we know there's one there, but we actually don't know what's in it, or we're not sure what we're supposed to do. So it would basically come back to, we just use our best judgment. Well, then why do you have a policy if everyone's just using their best judgment? So, and finally, thinking about how you can engage with all your stakeholders to find out what you need to know. So just some things to consider. Okay, once you have done your analysis, then the next step is development. And really, it's about getting everybody on board, including the athletes, to create your safe sport strategy. So you bring them all together and you agree on what's reasonable and realistic, because everyone has their own perspective, their own lived experience, and they can all share to help you know what's going to work. It's really about leveraging and enhancing what you already have within your organization or other aligned organizations. It's not starting from scratch, but overall, really, it looks like that you want to have some aligned policy around all levels of your organization. You want some minimum training standards. You want communication engagement with all stakeholders. And generally, you want resources on an online hub. So when you're thinking about what do you need to develop or mandate and what are your top priorities, they usually fall into one of these 4 categories. And if you cover something in each one of these 4 categories, you'll start to actually ensure that you're covering your bases in terms of creating your safe sport strategy and knowing that it's actually working. So I'm sure a lot of you do have safe sport policies. We have at Sport Law and Strategy Group, we developed what's called a safe sport policy suite, because after about 3 decades of writing policies for organization, our policy writers really did have the knowledge to be creating the sort of latest and greatest, and it's been changing. I know if any of you have been developing policy, it has been changing quite rapidly based on all of the changes at the national level. Normally, you would be looking at your policy every few years, but really now it's very important to make sure that you have all of these policies or something that at least covers these areas. So in terms of those 4 sort of key components, these are the things that others are doing in this area. So around policy, even at the provincial, territorial, or club level, others are aligning with what the UCCMS says. And they're updating and aligning policy between their levels of sport organization so that if something happens at the club level, everybody's working off the same policy and everybody's familiar with the same process, and that helps to leverage your resources so that at the provincial or club level you can leverage what your national sport organization's doing to be able to sort of communicate that out. It's all one policy. The processes are the same, and marketing and communicating that with others at all all different stakeholders, including parents and athletes and coaches, then everyone's on the same page, and it just makes much more sense. In terms of training, the mandating safe sport training, either Coaches Association of Canada's free training or Respect in Sport for all your stakeholders. So a lot of people are doing this for their coaches, but really what you want to be doing is mandating it for your athletes, your coaches, your administrators, decision makers, parents, officials, anybody who is connected with your organization really needs to be on the same page in terms of the expectations. And then the EDII for indigeneity, having training that sort of broadens people's scope on these things is so important. Again, then you're all talking the same language. You're all being clear about what's expected. Excuse me. Just around engagement, we know that the NSOs are engaging with their provincial and club levels to ensure a consistent approach. If your NSO is not, maybe reach out and talk to them about what they're doing and seeing how you can leverage what they're doing at your level. But what we also know is that all levels of sport are engaging with their athletes and coaches to make sure at least they understand the policies that you have in place. And then in terms of resources, creating some sort of online hub of safe sport information, including links or tools to other resources, is very important. And seeking out experts who could potentially provide some specialized support, for example, in mental health, that can help, especially if you join forces with others. Again, if your NSO is doing something or others that you can align with are doing it, then that's a great way to sort of share resources and costs. So if you get consensus on all these things, the next important piece is the implementation, and implementation is nothing without communication, and a strategy is nothing without implementation. So it's important that you consider all of those things. In terms of your communication plan, really, it's very important that you have an internal plan for your board, staff, and volunteers that really are going to be executing it. So you want to develop some frequently asked questions and some common messaging. So again, you're all on the same page. And then an external plan for your athletes, coaches, parents, officials, and others. So everyone understands what the changes are coming and how you came to these decisions. And then finally, the measurement. And really, one of the best ways to measure is by athlete engagement. You specifically ask them, do you feel safe? And that safe, that applies more psychologically and physically. It's depending on your trust levels, you may want to use anonymous or third-party surveys so people feel really safe in answering. And then follow up with in-person group discussions about behavior expectations for them and their coaches. So it's really important. I can't stress enough how important it is to involve your athletes. And because if you create those safe and welcoming environments, encourage curiosity, and are flexible and authentic, they will respond to you. They will feel empowered and heard. And really that starts to build the high trust relationships where they feel it's safe to be open and honest and tell you when things are not okay. Again, we'll share these slides with you, but here are some resources and leading practices around safe sport in Canada. And just as a final thought, really from the boardroom to the field of play, how do you know your policies and training that your board approves are being communicated, understood, and followed by all your stakeholders, including athletes? And with that, actually, Jesse, if you want to run poll number 2, it really just builds off of this last slide. I want to see how people are feeling about the intent of your policies and trainings and whether or not it's being communicated, understood, and followed at the field of play level.
More here.
So it looks like most of you voted.
So somewhat confident is starting here. Oh, another couple there, sorry. So yeah, somewhat confident at 44%. Probably the highest answer there. Not at all confident though with 33%. And confident 22.
Yeah. So with that, hopefully I've given you some ideas on how to hopefully become more confident in your ability for that. And again, the sheet is there, and we'll be taking more questions about the strategy part after Michelle speaks. So turning over to Michelle, I think you're going to share your screen right now. Oh, and Jesse, I think we have poll number 3 that can run at this time.
For sure. And here we go, everyone. Okay, we have the majority in here. So have you had to deal with a safe sport complaint? 61% have said yes. And then for are you worried about having to deal with a safe sport complaint? 56% are saying yes.
Okay, thank you. So I guess for the not sure if you're worried about having to deal with the safe sport complaint, I'm a little curious. Are you unsure about whether it's a safe sport complaint, or I'm throwing that out there. I don't really need for anybody to have to answer. So yes, as you can probably imagine from the poll, I'm going to talk about complaints. Let me see. All right, so LJ did an excellent job of laying the groundwork as to what organizations should have in place when dealing with, well, to deal with anything. And this is what we commonly see, that organizations have issues when they either they don't have policies or procedures to deal with these things, or they're not clear. The rules are there in the policies, but either they're not complete. If they're too vague, people don't understand what it is that's expected of them or what they have to do. So that's a problem. And sometimes they're contradictory. Sometimes something is defined in one policy as being an infraction or an offense, and it is not in another. So that can be an issue as well. Also, yeah, organizations might set out the policies, but then don't follow them. I think that came up earlier. They, like with the concussion example, they might have this process in place, but well, we just use our judgment anyway, and that's not a good thing either. So the next point, they have policies that don't fit with their culture or their resources. So I saw that a lot of you are from NSOs, some from PSOs. So the resource issue might not be so much for you, but possibly for your members. So what I want to say about that point is sometimes organizations, if they don't have the resources, their policy suite might include all the bells and whistles. And by that, I mean, it might account for a case manager, a 3-person panel, a mandatory investigation. All of these things cost money. So if you're setting the bar high, like if you're saying this has to be an independent outside third-party case manager, you need to be aware that your organization will have to pay something for that. Similarly with the mandatory investigation, investigations can be quite costly. And I will talk about this a little more later, but if you can get away with a one-person panel for a discipline hearing instead of 3, try to do that. Usually we limit a 3-person panel to really serious infractions. So if you can have 1 as your default, you'll have to pay them an honorarium at some point. So it's a little more cost effective and time effective to have 1 panelist instead of 3. So another pitfall is failing to review. So the same policies that served your organization 10 years ago are probably not going to serve you very well today, because as LJ set out, a lot of these behaviors are no longer acceptable in sport. So sometimes organizations don't have a complaint for 10 years and then they realize, oh dear, our policies are a little outdated and that we don't really define these things that should really be infractions as infractions. That can be a problem. So yes, as we've set out, so policies will provide you with a guide for your actions, because it's, again, not even just a guide for you, but it provides everybody with the expectation as to what will be done. So that provides clarity for everybody. Yes, as we said, help you avoid a problem or crisis just because you have the steps there to manage them. Yeah, so uniformly, consistently, and fairly, that will be key. If you get a complaint and it does end up going to a hearing, then you'll be able to point to the policy and just say, this is the policy we always follow. It's followed equally and uniformly for everybody, and that contributes to the appearance of fairness. So yeah, this is the ultimate reactive strategy. If you have managed a complaint, was there something that went really sideways because it wasn't fully accounted for in the policy? What could we do better about the process? Could we improve communication somehow? Could we close any gaps? And this is what I always advise, because too often I see organizations come to me and say, we've received a complaint, we're not really sure how to deal with it, the policies don't really allow for this. Or I work through it with them and we realize that, okay, well, we have provision for an investigative report, but we don't have anywhere in the policy where it's actually provided to the parties or used at the hearing. So what good is having an investigation and report if we can't actually use it? So what I recommend, if you haven't had a complaint of this nature or any kind of complaint that went to a hearing or anything, do a test run. If you were to receive a complaint today, and this is on the worksheet we provided as well, if you receive a complaint today, what would the first step be? Who would be the person receiving complaints? Do people know who your person is who's designated to receive complaints? That should be publicly displayed if possible. That leads into my next point. So the old way of doing things was maybe a board member would receive a complaint, or it wasn't really clear who was going to receive a complaint, and that would result, and still does, in a lot of different people going to different board members and just telling them about complaints, where now we really strongly recommend that you have one person in the organization who will receive complaints, and you make that public knowledge. That should be on your website, that should be in your policy, because that just directs people as to where to go if they have a complaint. So sometimes the organization will have a person within the organization who will do it. So that can be, sometimes it's a staff member, like LJ said, sometimes it's somebody employed just for that reason. If you can, it's good to appoint a case manager who's an outside third party. If that's not possible for you because of resource issues, then it should be somebody internal who is the person who's designated to receive the complaints. I think I'm going to get to this a little bit later. Oh, yep, down there. So if this person receiving complaints, there's always a possibility for conflict. So an easy fix there is to you can say in the policy that this certain person will receive complaints, and then a comma or in brackets, a designate or delegate, because that gives that person an out if they do find themselves to be in a conflict. So yeah, anyway, so it does depend on the policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but the complaint should always be in writing. This should actually be 2 different bullet points. The complaint should be in writing just because there needs to be a paper trail. And in the end, when you're putting that whole complaint record together, you will need to have that complaint in writing because that will be ultimately what possibly goes to a panel. As for timeline restrictions, some older policies will have a timeline restriction like 14 days, 21 days, which is fine for something that happens in front of everybody at an AGM, say some inappropriate behavior. But if, like we're seeing these days with complaints of historical allegations of abuse and bullying and harassment, 14 days is pretty ridiculous. So in a lot of those policies, we do see an exception. So if it says 14 days unless an acceptable explanation is provided to the executive director, and then they have discretion to accept it, you're still taking a chance because that person can say, no, I'm not accepting this outside the 14 days and my decision is not appealable. So that creates a problem. So there really shouldn't be any timeline restrictions. If there is, you should always have that exception in writing so that if the respondent then challenges why the complaint was accepted outside of the window, you will have a paper trail. Yeah, so in some cases, sometimes an organization will receive several anonymous complaints or complainants who do not want to reveal their identities for good reasons. In that case, the organization, if it's permitted by your policy, the organization can actually act as the complainant. And then the original complainants become witnesses to that complaint. So that's usually done if, like I say, if the original complainants would like to be anonymous, or say you have 10 complaints about the same person and it just makes more sense in terms of streamlining the process and in terms of resources for the organization to actually act as the complainant and move forward with that. So the complaint, sometimes policies will set this out. It's really nice when they do, but generally, even if the policy doesn't explicitly set this out, you can ask for this information. So some organizations will have a form on their website or a complaint form that's available to complainants where they will ask for this information. So you will need the complainant's name and contact information, even if they wish to remain anonymous going forward, which is sometimes possible. You need to be, or the designate or the case manager needs to be able to contact them. The respondent must be identified, and they won't always have their contact information. If they do, that's great. It's a really good idea to have the complainant tell you what section of which policies they believe have been violated. Or if you don't do this, you will get a 50-page complaint with a lot of stories, and there likely will be some serious allegations in there somewhere, but it will be a lot of work for you to try and pick through that, or the case manager or designate, and try and figure out what the alleged violations actually are. And then along with that, you will want all evidence to support the complaint. And this isn't always necessary at the outset. Sometimes this does come later as people information gather, as they remember. But typically the role of the designate or case manager or person accepting the complaint, they will need to decide if the complaint has merit or if it's frivolous or vexatious. And the more evidence that the person has to support the complaint, clearly if they have evidence, it's not going to be a vexatious complaint. It's also a good idea to ask the complainant what they wish to get out of this. That will often assist in determining whether the complaint is meritorious or not. If they request something really crazy that's just beyond the scope of your policy, then there might be a bigger issue. At the same time, if it's not a really serious allegation and they're requesting an apology or something that doesn't involve suspension, then you can likely proceed with a less formal procedure if your policy allows that. And so my last point, if the complaint is incomplete or vague, ask for a rewrite. I have done this and been told to go fly a kite because my client's policy said that if the allegations fall within the policies, then we have to accept the complaint. and what could I do? They had me, it actually did say that. So you can always ask for a rewrite, but you may or may not get it. So if it is somewhere in your policy or a form, that's a good thing. So this looks like a lot of information. It's more just an expansion of what I've already said. So the case manager or designate will decide whether or not the complaint can proceed if it has merit. The case manager or designate also has the wonderful job of informing the parties about the complaint. So it's not such a big deal when you're saying to the complainants, hey, I know I've received this complaint from the organization, I'm the case manager. From the complainant, you can expect a lot of, sometimes they will need support, especially if they're not represented by counsel. The complainant's not usually such an issue, but when you, and I'll get to this a little later on, when you inform the respondent, be prepared to be yelled at. That will be guaranteed almost. So don't take it personally. In any case, you will have to, as I said, determine if the complaint is frivolous. You can also request clarifying documentation. So aside from them having to set out what their alleged policy violations are, you can request other documentation as well if that will assist in your decision. And sometimes this is a bit down the road if you've decided whether there will be a panel hearing. The case manager or designate is really just the point person. So you're the go-between. So instead of the person going to the rest of the organization, everything goes through you as the designate or case manager. So you will distribute the complaint, the response to the parties. You will distribute things among them. And yes, so investigator, if the policy allows for an investigation, if it's mandatory, then the case manager will have to appoint an independent investigator who is then usually independent from the case manager and the organization. Propose use of mediation. So this raises the point of, and I'm pretty sure I saw it in the Safe Sport policy suite, if it's not part of a policy, sometimes it's a standalone policy, the alternative dispute resolution policy, which can, sometimes you will propose mediation to parties and thinking they're so far apart, they won't possibly take it. And usually those are the ones that are actually successful. So it's always worth asking. So yeah, the case manager typically establishes timelines. Sometimes I've seen in some policies, the case manager, if they decide there's going to be a panel hearing, the panel will establish the timelines, but typically that is the case manager's job. And that involves keeping note of the timelines. So if somebody is beyond the timelines, you will have to chase them down for materials or disallow it, which isn't always a good idea. So determine the appropriate process. So most policies will account for a minor or major infraction. So the case manager, and that's always a fun job too, telling the respondent that you've designated the complaint against them a major infraction. And this is going way to the end, distribute the decision, if any. So that can be your decision on whether it's a major infraction or minor infraction. That can also be at the end when there's a panel decision too. That will be your responsibility. General complaint management tips. So when you are choosing an ideal case manager within your organization or outside of your organization, you want somebody who's experienced in this area because they are aware of what to expect from the parties. They have to be a clear communicator, obviously, and they're going to have to be doing a lot of written communication, so they will need to be clear in what is expected of the parties. Strong technical writer. I would say, yeah, a technical writer, just because they will have to, sometimes they assist the panel in writing decisions. Sometimes they will have to just write to the parties and describe what policies they're using and why. Obviously not in a conflict or biased and does not favor one side or the other. So like I said before, the complainant will need support. You can be supportive and not favor. So you just, as long as everybody is treated equally and fairly, that's checks all those boxes. And that takes us to procedural fairness. So that means that the respondent is going to have to know the case against them. So this almost always involves disclosing the identity of the complainant. So the principle being that a person cannot meaningfully respond to allegations against them if they don't know the case they have to meet. So if they are in the dark about any of these things, then that makes meaningful response very difficult. So as long as they know the case, has a good opportunity to respond, like plenty of time, that goes a long way towards fairness. And then the decision maker, because the case manager or designate will oftentimes have to choose somebody to hear this matter. Obviously not biased, not conflict of interest. That's not really your job to determine. If you say to a potential panel member, this is the case, this is the organization, you might need to give them a name too, of complainant and or respondent. I think it's up to the panelists to let you know if they have a conflict of interest, and that's always been my experience. But so you'll just want to help. As the case manager, you'll probably have to coordinate administrative aspects as well. So you will need to ensure that both sides have an equal opportunity to be heard. And so this is also on my worksheet. So in your policies, you will want to ensure that if you do get a complaint concerning, like involving really serious allegations, you will want to know what the mechanism is, or if you have a mechanism for suspension of that individual pending determination of the outcome. So the policy will often set out who has the power to suspend in this case. Sometimes it's the board, but they will need to decide what to do while that's being heard. If you're unsure, it's good to seek guidance from your governing body and or legal counsel if you have them, just to be sure, because suspension, while they don't prejudge the individual in respect of guilt or anything like that, it is pretty serious, especially when this person might be relying on their livelihood, their reputation. So if they're coaching or gym owners, say, if they're suspended and can't earn their livelihood, that creates some issues, obviously, for everybody. And it also shortens the timelines of the proceedings, because if someone is suspended, you want to get this process moving as quickly as possible. So typically, infractions in policies are divided into minor versus major. So minor is, less serious, like it maybe some yelling during a game, a one-off kind of offense. So for stuff like that, typically the procedure is a little less formal. So it doesn't involve such long timelines and so much written material. And then the penalties are not as serious either, so it can be an apology. Sometimes they do range to suspension. I've seen that. The major infraction is more obviously more serious infractions, and for the major infractions, typically that's when you would maybe have an investigation and appoint a panel to hear that. But major infractions can also include repeated minor. So if somebody has on their record a whole bunch of minor infractions, then that's together could constitute a major infraction. And then, so the sanctions are typically the same, a little more lengthy suspension and also possible expulsion. So this is just a sort of a broad overview. So from start to finish, receive complaints, focus, accepts, sends to respondent, and then the respondent has to have a chance to respond, the writing, judicial body, and then a hearing and decision. So I'm talking fast. I think I'm running out of time. I'm gonna have time for questions. So yes, I just wanted to raise this because sometimes, like I said before, the complainant wishes to remain anonymous, and this isn't always possible for the reasons set out. I said discuss later. I think I moved this slide. It should be discussed earlier. And then, so this is a big one I come across. Can the complainant or can anyone submit material to the judicial body, to the panel, without the other party seeing it? No. No, that can result in allegations of bias, lack of procedural fairness. If the person making the decision is going to see what's being submitted, all parties have to see it. That's just a general rule. Oh yes, and so as the case manager, this could be your responsibility too. If parties are producing witness statements, they need to know why they're producing them. So it always bears reminding to tell the parties that if they are going to submit anything, that other parties and the panel are going to see it. Yeah, so I get this question. When does there need to be an in-person hearing instead of just documents? And sometimes the policy will set this out. Typically, if it's a he said, or she said situation, and the writing doesn't really show what happened, then the panel will likely want to speak to the parties to see who's more credible. Because typically, unless your writing includes a lot of inconsistencies, it's hard to see on paper who's the more credible person. So if it comes down to just who is more believable, then the panel will need to hear. Yes, I think I alluded to this earlier. When should there be a 3-person judicial body instead of a single? Just when it's really serious. And usually policies will allow for this. So the default position is 1 panel member, and the default is if there are, usually it says exceptional circumstances, then a 3-person panel can be appointed. But again, that results in delay and extra costs. So it's an exceptional remedy. And then, yeah, so same things apply as before. So the panel, whoever's hearing it, everybody has to contact everybody else. So one party can't contact the panel with something or material, everybody has to be copied. So I put here through the case manager, that's ideal. Sometimes I've seen the panel email everybody and copy the case manager just for expediency. So that can happen too. But yeah, it's the appearance of fairness that everybody sees everything else. What if the complainant is also at fault? I come across this a lot too. So the respondent will say, yeah, I did it, but the complainant did all these terrible things too. Well, unless there's a formal cross complaint filed on behalf of the respondent, who then becomes the complainant to another complaint, the behavior of the complainant might only go to credibility. It's the complainant's not the one being disciplined. So yes, as a designator case manager, I think probably a lot of this goes without saying, be professional and neutral. Always communicate via email. And if I get questions, if one party calls me, which happens a lot, I will say, please put your questions in writing, because the chances are if you have questions, the other party does too about the process or anything else. And my practice is to try and communicate with all parties at the same time, while BCCing them, of course. Yeah, in terms of guidance, it is really difficult as the person accepting complaints and making decisions. You will want to advise people, especially when the complainant comes to you and says, should I file this complaint? Should I testify? Should I do this? It's really hard to not advise sometimes. And it's fine to guide and say, this is what the policy says. It's a little more difficult sometimes to refrain from advising people. So beware of that. So let's see, no response. Yes, so what do you do if a respondent or a complainant stops responding? You should try to keep up with that. If they might not respond to you in email, and you don't want to be phoning a respondent, but if you might need to go elsewhere in the organization to just see if there's somebody who knows a better way to get in touch with them. Because ultimately the process will continue without them, even if they're not participating. And you want to give them all possible chances to respond, especially if they're going to be sanctioned. And requests for delay must be reasonable. That probably goes without saying. Just one last thing here, I'll try to wrap up. As the case manager, as I mentioned before, the respondent will probably be very angry with you. It's not your fault, just don't take it personally. Your job is to look at the complaint, determine whether it falls within the policy, and if it does, is it a major or minor infraction based on the allegations? So yeah, so don't accept a request for a phone call. I can tell you that typically they don't request a phone call, they just call, and you don't know who it is. So if you pick it up, you might get an earful. My practice there is to just say, I understand yelling at me is not going to change my decision. If you have questions, please email me. And I usually have to say that about 10 times, but eventually gets there. Counsel, you might get counsel. I don't think I've done too many of these things, but they will challenge the process, and sometimes they're even right. Sometimes they pick out something that you have inadvertently skipped over, and you might have to go back and fix that. Maybe involved in sport for the first time. That's true. I have one respondent who his counsel is his real estate lawyer, but just because they're friends, he wants him to represent him in a sports dispute. So that's always interesting. As long as you stick to the policy, you're good. Of course, they can appeal or take it to court, but if they haven't exhausted all the complaint and appeal remedies, then they're probably not going to be very successful in court, chances are. So one last thing I want to touch on, communication and publishing of decisions. So typically this hasn't been done in the past. There's no really good database where you can go and search for people that have been sanctioned and for what in what sport. Nowadays, there's a lot better public communication, and there are good reasons for this. So while you might not want to always publish a decision on your website, you should keep it on file. Your policies should say it can be a matter of public record unless ordered otherwise. It has to be reported to your governing body. And if your policy doesn't allow for this, that can lead to liability issues for you as an organization later down the road. Because if somebody is expelled or suspended for an offense while coaching, and this is not public knowledge and is kept hidden away, if another organization hires that person and they reoffend, that could make you liable. So just little bit of a scary thought. So do what you can to get that out there without, of course, we don't want to invade anybody's privacy, but if it's a safety issue, then it needs to be told at least to your governing body. And that's about it. Sorry, that was a rapid fire, a lot of information.
Oh, we're good, and we're happy to stay on. We're good for another half an hour for whoever wants to stay, and we're open for questions. Either you can put them in the chat or just raise your hand or speak, however you want. And if you'd like to talk to us separately and about either strategy or complaints, we can do that too. So just let us know what you want.
So just looking at the chat, when I said unsure that persons will come forward because they may feel the policies are unclear, vague, and lacking in confidence of confidentiality. Those are all really good points. And I think LJ's presentation addressed some of that, where what can we do to make sure that the policies are clear? Like, can we have a form on the website saying, please put your complaint here, it will go only to this person, it will be kept confidential? Because I struggle with that too, to be honest. I have a lot of complainants coming forward and saying, I want this to be confidential. I understand the respondent needs to know, but I don't want anyone else to know. So that's where it's good to have the independent third party. And I always explain to parties that yes, it is kept confidential. In the end, a final decision might not be confidential to the degree you hope it will be. But we can work with that. But they have to know that. I think what they're afraid of usually, and correct me if I'm wrong, is reprisals and further bullying. I see a lot of relational bullying and stuff like that in retaliation to complaints, even though I've told the respondent this behavior is not acceptable, it still happens. So I get that.
I have a question. When we were talking about confidentiality, and you have this case manager that they accept this role, do you have them sign a declaration of confidentiality, or is it just a understood piece of information?
That's an excellent question. I think if you're hiring a case manager, it's sometimes a lawyer. It's usually somebody who has practice in the field and who has experience in the field with all of this kind of thing. So you could definitely cover that with an agreement, but they should know, especially if they're telling the parties, their job is to tell the parties that the policy says this process is confidential. So you would hope that they would know that that means them as well. They cannot disclose. And honestly, I have this problem too, where an organization will hire me to case manage something and then keep asking me for updates. Say I can't. I'm the independent. This is why you're asking me to do this, and I will give you the published decision and whatever else needs to be provided under the policy, but you don't get to have updates. It's just that would violate the confidentiality provisions. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Like you even think about the minor infractions, right? So you may have a case manager who could possibly be a volunteer if it's a small enough organization, but you still want to have those policies in place for the safe sport. But if you have, that case manager is a volunteer and they're just dealing with some of the minor infractions, and you've got the policies to cover it. You still want to make sure that while you're still a volunteer, you still have to abide by all of this information and things like that. So that's kind of where you get that little bit of a gray area because the person might have a background in a legal background, but they may, or ethics and things like that. So that would be okay. But sometimes you just get, it's hard to find the right volunteer. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see, what is the going rate? I'll take that one first. The going rate of honoraria for adjudicators. It's pretty small. I would say like 500 to 1,000 is typically what we offer. A couple of things with that. It's a cost issue, and it's also sort of a volunteer. It's sort of volunteer work for them, and you don't. It's a little problematic if you give a lot of money, because then it looks like the organization might be paying the adjudicator to make a certain decision. So you really want to, and maybe that's just me being worst case scenario, but you want to treat everybody the same. So if you pay a panel member a certain amount for something, you don't want to pay different panel members different amounts, especially if they talk to each other, which hopefully they won't, confidentiality. So yeah, that's I would say the adjudicator rate is probably not your biggest cost. I think the case management, the investigation can definitely be the most costly. Let's see, redaction and decisions. I can take that one too. The accepted practice is typically to, if the complainants are minors, or if the subject matter is very sensitive, the complainants' names will get redacted just to protect their privacy. Sometimes the witnesses as well. Yeah, it depends how the decision is written, because when they're describing witnesses and people mentioned, they might not always use their full names. So that's not such an issue, but definitely, yeah, if it's sensitive, the complainants are young, they will get redacted, but the the respondent typically does not get redacted.
I think we had Denny LaBay and Bill Bain. So Denny, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to thank you, LJ, and you, Michelle. That was really interesting. Michelle is where I was most interested when you came on. That kind of got my attention more. But what you have said, LJ, was great as well. I don't have a name for the SAC Management Manitoba, but that was good introduction as well. I enjoyed it. This is my first. I missed the first one on Monday, and yesterday was postponed to the next time. But I'm looking forward to the other three that I have scheduled. Thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Bill, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thanks very much to both of you. That was very good. I do have a question. So I volunteer with an NSO, and the NSO has a third-party individual that handles complaints. And a couple of days ago, when we heard Gretchen talk, she talked about the upcoming changes in the Sport Canada landscape. And it sounds like it might very well be that there is a single point of contact for the entire sport scene in Canada that will receive the complaints and then triage and cover them off. Do you have any insight on what might be happening or when? And if so, does that mean that all of the sports will then no longer have their own individual third-party complaints manager?
Yeah, I can take that. So The answer is we're not quite sure because the organization, the entity has not been named yet. I think it's been chosen, but I don't think they have officially come out. And so essentially what was expected is that they'll spend the first year getting up and running and organized for the national sport organizations and but potentially starting with maybe a small pilot of organizations. I don't, but no one knows. There is some speculation that that is what could happen based on what's happened in Safe Sport USA, for example, and in other jurisdictions around the world when they've set up sort of their Safe Sport hub. But what I do know based on the RFP that Sport Canada put out for that entity is that it is a 4-year process that they're looking to fund, and then they definitely want this organization to be self-sustaining. So the expectation is that probably for the first few years, they'll cover some of the costs for national sport organizations to cover their that third party. So there will be sort of, you'll just direct all of your complaints to that one entity. And for consistency, that'll be amazing. The issue is then when we talked about alignment between the different levels within Canada, it gets difficult because obviously this new entity is not responsible for provincial, territorial, or club level dispute resolution, like during this mandate, that the 4-year mandate. However, if they decided they wanted to expand to that and offer it, and like you would cover those costs, they would definitely be moving to that for sure within, like, after the 4 years, because that would be part of their business model, I'm sure. But there's no, they do not have to, as per what Sport Canada wanted, to deal with any other level other than the national sport organizations and national athletes. In terms of just being able, like, anybody being able to contact them, I think that they're looking for sort of a response process that will hopefully not just send people away and say, sorry, we can't help you, but looking for ways to sort of more effectively triage the complaints that come in. Because, one thing that we know is that at a club level, if it's a serious case, it's going to come up to the national level anyway. Yep. Like the national sport organization generally ends up handling some of these cases, even if it's not with a national athlete, or because they still, especially if their jurisdiction is over that club level. So depending on the sport, depending on the jurisdiction within that organization, there are all these variables, but we do expect some of these answers to come soon. It was supposed to be announced at the end of March. So now we're like getting into like the end of May soon. So hopefully it'll be by the end of May, because national sport organizations had to implement the UCMS into their policies. They had to, as you know, my slide said, they had to do all these things. So this new entity is supposed to be helping implement all that stuff. So the sport organizations are sitting there going, well, okay, I have everything. Should I, as you said, should I appoint my own third party? So what we've been telling our clients is, yes, do your own thing, because it could take a year for this new entity to get up and running. You want to have something in place. If you then just end up sending all your people to the new entity, great. But in the meantime, I would set yourself up for success, knowing that it may not be ready for another year.
Very good. That was very helpful. Thank you.
I have a question that's unrelated to the discussion thus far, but I was wondering, in terms of the measurement piece that was spoken about earlier, the organization I'm with, Sport for Life Society, is a multi-sport service organization. So we don't have direct athlete contact, but I do recognize the role that we would have in terms of the programs and services that we offer to coaches and administrators, as well as the expert service work we do. But I'm just wondering, in terms of measurement, when we talk about some of the examples that you had given in terms of surveys with the athletes and the emphasis on consulting the athletes throughout the process, do you have any specific recommendations for an organization in our position where we might not be able to directly ask athletes that we're having an impact on?
Sure. I mean, and I am very familiar with Sport for Life. So, you know, and you always partner with others in terms of like making those connections. So either if you don't have, if somebody's, the athletes are connected to your programs, or the organization with the athletes is connected, then just go through them. Ideally, it's also, you know, you want the athletes to feel as safe as possible to answer. So even just bringing in a third party to connect with whoever is connected to the athletes can help you maintain that sort of safe space to be able to speak about, you know, whatever they want to. But in terms of if you have policies that you want to make sure that the people who are running your programs are following, the best way to do it is almost immediately after depending on how long the program is. So one of the things is you don't want to, if you are doing some measurement, there's a couple of points about measurement. One, if you're running a 13-week program and you want to see how it's going, you want to do a little touch base sort of halfway through the program, because if there's a major problem and you don't find out about it to the end, you've already lost those people for the next year. So, or any kind of return. So for any organization, what you want to do is sort of, once you've put in the practices in place, or even to get some sort of baseline measurement, you want to do it earlier on. And then you want to come back after you've made changes that should impact this result, to then come back and measure again and go, okay, so are we better now? And so whenever if you've got a new group coming through, it's always good to do some sort of baseline measurement earlier rather than later, so that you don't lose them if there is a problem.
Thank you.
We do have a question there in the chat. Does safe sport requirements change the competency requirements of board members?
Sorry, I don't think I understand the question completely. Do you, Michelle?
Competency requirements. Are you talking about, do they have to have different skills? I think that's, go ahead.
Hi, I'm the person. Hi, I'm the person who was asking the question.
Cool.
And I guess in terms of like recruiting board members, would you say like for a volunteer board, when it's going through its recruitment process, how might it express, or should it express, that some of the competencies that it's looking for is related to safe sport? And what does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, it's a great practice for sure. I don't know that, you know, generally what people do is just put them through the safe sport training, because now CAC's safe sport training is free, and they sort of have your choose your own adventure. So if people who have direct access to athletes, indirect athlete connections, or decision makers, all kind of get different versions of the safe sport training based on whether or not they're directly impacting athletes. And also, even normally all coaches training is tracked in the CAC's locker, But what CAC has done is working with organizations to actually track multitudes of people. You don't have to be a coach with a locker account at CAC to be able to be tracked for the safe sport training. So you could, so that's part of the answer is you basically want to have your people do the safe sport training. If you say, if you want to put that in the sort of requirements of their competencies to say that, understanding of the safe sport environment in Canada is an asset, or depending on, what your board typical competencies are, whether or not you like what your governance model is and how you utilize your board members, that would have an impact on, what competencies you're looking for. But at this point, I think that just having them at least start to be familiar with safe sport concepts and the training and their responsibilities is probably a good starting point. Just reading Jeff's question here. So I wonder how you might suggest dividing the roles, tasks you identified between the board with their oversight responsibilities and staff who presumably have more capacity to dive into this. Are there some things that really should stay with the board and cannot be delegated to staff? Well, Michelle, why don't you answer this?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. The board obviously definitely has oversight responsibilities. The board should be a governing board. So anything that has to do with writing policies, governance of the organization, and then the staff should be responsible for the operational aspects. So staff should run all of the day-to-day stuff, and that typically would, under the umbrella of this presentation, that would include complaints. The board, I feel, should only be involved with complaint type stuff if their direction is absolutely necessary. So what we used to see is the board used to do everything, right? Before we had a lot of staff people, and the board would run everything as a volunteer board. They would govern, they would just micromanage everything because they had to. And now we're trying to get away from that, but the policies haven't always caught up. So some policies will still say the complaint gets filed to the president, and the president and the vice president decide if it's going forward. And then the discipline committee is the president, vice president, and 2 other directors. And there's just no getting away. And then the appeals committee is similarly constituted. So, I think I got a little off track there, but I think my initial point was the board sticks with governance. If the board decides that staff should handle certain things, the board will decide that. So I guess, yeah, governance versus operations.
Well, and just knowing that there are so many boards that still have that operating board governance model. So if you are one of those boards, then just move towards a more governing body process for sure. You want to make sure that you put into place. I think this is where you want to make sure that the policies are created in a way that's going to make everyone's life easier. There's another part of his question.
Yeah, I think just what you were saying, LJ. I think you were building.
Like to see building the policies, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, the board's role is to make sure that everything's in place. But also, overall, the board should be making sure that all these policies are in place. But if the board thinks its job is done at that point, that's not true. That the board must direct that this, that there should be some sort of strategy or process that's more encompassing than just posting policies on a website. That's the job of the board, is to take a more high level view of all of these things. And so in your capacity as a president or just a board member, you still have that responsibility to make sure that the policies are being created appropriately. And what we've given you is sort of the leading edge way of developing safe sport policy and making sure and what your complaints management process should look like. We know that this does not exist in many organizations in Canada at different levels. So, if you're feeling like, oh, we don't have all these things, you're not alone. But what we would say is you don't want to find out that you're missing the boat when you're in a complaint. That's the worst time to be finding out. But this is what we see all the time. This is the proactive versus reactive. Proactive, you're gonna come back now and look at everything you have and see if you actually are you've got all your boxes checked. And that's something that worksheet, both those worksheets can help you be more proactive. If you're already in a complaint, or that's the reactive mode, all you're doing now is trying to just manage the fires that are coming up. And it really, and then crisis management is sort of your top priority. That being said, crisis management should be part of your plan, so that if a complaint is not handled the way the complainant or respondent wants, and they decide to go to the media, you want to be able to say that we handled this according to our policies and be able to back up your process and your decision making based on the policies you have. And that's where, again, the board gets held accountable for that. So in your roles as board members, you want to make sure that all these things are put in place before you get to a complaint. And I know somebody said earlier, there's always going to be complaints, and that's true. But how you handle those complaints and whether or not it's going to be an easy process for everyone and relatively cut and dried in terms of the process is up to you as board members.
And Jeff, to just follow up on your last point there, who do we like to see building the policies? I have seen staff often build policies and suggest things to the board. I think there's nothing wrong with doing that. I think as the staff being the people who are running the day-to-day operations of the organization, the staff likely knows what policies are working and how well and what could be improved. So I think it goes both ways. I think it's always a good idea for staff to suggest changes or amendments. And yeah, you're right, the board has approval, but the board isn't always involved in the day-to-day management. So having staff
and it's the intent, right? Yeah. It's the intent of what is, in fact, like whoever's building, and I'm not sure if when you say building, you mean writing, you definitely, like, the intent of the policy is going to come from either staff or board based on their experiences with what needs to happen. But whoever's writing the policy should have some legal background, because otherwise you run into issues, that loopholes that aren't covered and things like that. So I recognize we're at our time. So thanks everyone. If you have any final questions, go ahead. But and feel free, you have our contact information. We'll send out the PowerPoint, and all the best in your sport ventures.
Yes, thanks so much.